Blue Boar Tavern. I'm Jonathan, your friendly bartender. Hello to Germany, to Canada, to Texas, Atlanta, Virginia, wonderful Alaska. You're all welcome. Welcome. Come on in, sit at your tables, um, order a beverage, and just want to thank you all very much for being our loyal live viewers who come in here every time. Thanks for stopping by, or whether you're watching us later on YouTube in our far-flung future, that's wonderful. If you're there, please hit like and subscribe to help boost us with the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship algorithms, because this is really working. I was just thinking today that 4 years ago this month, the Blue Boar Tavern started. At that point, we had, I think, 12 viewers. So we started modestly, grew. Now every episode gets thousands of views through YouTube. So this is all thanks to you guys. Thank you very much. I noticed we have some people out in our parking lot there, some of our regulars. Phoebe is coming back after a time away pursuing pursuits. Dorothea, Alex, special guest, who I will introduce in a moment when he shows up here. There he is. There's our Bob Prechter, our special guest for the week. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
Phoebe, Alex, Dorothea, I was just about to tell people, keep it short this time, shorter, just asking you all out there, viewers, YouTubers, just bringing up the word of the day, affordability. Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship can always use help. We're just like everybody else, being hit in that area. Membership dues only cover about a fifth of our financial needs. And like I mentioned, in recent years, we've really this is a focus from being a group for like-minded people to chat among ourselves to really being an active force in promoting Edward de Vere and the public consciousness. So whatever you can do, when you think about what Edward de Vere means in your lives and the authorship question, maybe think about trading one meal a month, offering it up to Edward de Vere, maybe one fancy beverage a month, walk by and say, oh, what I would give for that, I will give to Edward de Vere this week. And simply go to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website, look for donate, click on that, and then follow the instructions. And in our last episode, you can do that right now, and several people did during our last episode. We got some very nice donations at that time. So thank you. Let's get to our guest. Chat amongst ourselves with the chat buttons. We'll try to get to you as we can. We have to note, don't we, everybody? This is happy birthday and death day to Shakespeare, the player who sold wool and grain and stone and invested in real estate. And actually, this is going to be how I tortuously get to our topic for today. As much as we mock and deride poor Mr. Shaxper, when you think about it, according to some scenarios, maybe we have a lot to thank him for too. Because if he was a pawn being used among much more powerful people, maybe he helped us get the works, which might not have been otherwise saved if not for somebody being a front man or taking credit for it instead of the person we're going to talk about, who is probably also a pawn of very powerful people, Edward de Vere's and his reputation. Right. So what do we think of that, Dorothea? Here's what we think. He was profligate. He was arrogant. He was vain and haughty. Right. He was monstrous. Right.
He was right. According to Charles Arundel, while Charles was being interrogated in the Tower for treason, along with his buddies Henry Howard, and what's his first name? Southwell. Is it Francis Southwell? When he was about to be really taken to pieces over having given information to the Spanish and the French ambassador and a 4-year plan, called Oxford a monstrous adversary. And Alan Nelson picked up those two words, he called them a lot of other things too, and made that a title of a book which has given Oxford's character a real character assassination and called him scandalous, irresponsible, with a chaotic personal life. And that is the way that Alan Nelson wanted De Vere to go down in history. So why? What is it that so offended Alan Nelson about how did Edward de Vere offend Alan Nelson? Like, why would anyone do that?
Because he's such an offensive person by definition.
And
Maybe.
a bad person can't be a good writer.
A bad person couldn't be Shakespeare?
Yeah, yeah, that's why. That's the reason. Yeah.
Yeah. Does this play into another Stratfordian myth to have De Vere be vilified?
Well, he wasn't gentle, meaning meek and mild, like the Stratfordian was, right? That's what gentle meant back then, is meek and mild and kindly.
Now,
Like Burleigh and Leicester and all the other people of the day.
right,
Yeah, who were all
like the
gentle.
Stratfordian who basically sued everybody else in Stratford, that guy, and argued over everything and hoarded grain. He was also gentle and sweet and mild.
Kindly, yeah.
Kindly, yeah, yeah. Well, I also think that some of the myths about Oxford begin because of Oxfordians. I think we do from time to time, read a book by an Oxfordian of old, somebody who has done groundbreaking work 100 years ago, 50 years ago. We revere those people, pun intended, and they say something that becomes what we all repeat. And yet, as new information comes out, as new research is done, as we look at other individuals, as we look at what Oxford's other choices are, as new facts come to light, as people who have expertise in particular areas point things out, we find out that a lot of those things simply aren't true. And so, what the purpose of this episode is to explore some of those myths and compare what we know now about Oxford to perhaps what was known then and dispel some of those myths about him. And
People actually looking into his finances and
yeah, by actually looking into his
wardship
finances,
records.
actually doing the research on why he was selling pieces of land and what he was doing with the money and whether he died in debt and whether he was truly a terrible husband and did he really have an exceptionally bad temper and was he truly a spendthrift and did he actually marry Elizabeth Trentham for her money and was he irreligious and did he die hopelessly in debt and was he a child molester? All of these charges have been brought against him. And sometimes people, was he really a party boy? Was he a party boy more than anybody else was a party boy? And did a cloud hang over him? Was he truly an outsider to the court? So we asked Bob Prechter to join us here in the pub and raise a beer because Bob has done a tremendous amount of research on what Oxford's contemporaries, that is not Alan Nelson writing 400 years later, but people who actually knew him have said about him. And I thought a good way to kick this episode off as we all mull those questions is to ask Bob to tell us what people who actually knew the man said about him.
I can help there.
Okay, go for it.
On the front page of the SOF website, there's a tab called Discover Shakespeare. If you do the drop-down menu, you'll find something called Oxford's accolades. And there are 62 long quotes in there. And I said, what I want to do is cull from there just the nuggets about his personality, about his character. So I'm going to read you some of those. They're called Way Down, but they're going to give us a really good picture of what his contemporaries thought of him. I'm going to start when he was 19 years old. So this is Thomas Underdown in An Ethiopian History. First of all, he lectures Oxford a little bit. He says, you're becoming altogether too bookish. So I think we can trust him when he says something nice about the guy. And he says, for such virtues be in your honor, courage joined with great skill, sufficiency in learning. And then we get to the important words, good nature and common sense. Now, that's not something you hear from Nelson. And he calls him the right pattern of a noble gentleman, which in my head I have conceived. Okay, so he was only 19. Maybe he got worse later, right? And 3 years later, Thomas Bedingfield, in his dedication for Cardinus Comfort, he says, you delight to see others acquitted of cares. So that tells us that when Oxford saw someone in distress or somebody having troubles, he tried to help them out. So he was kind of generous that way. Dr. George Baker, 1574, your honor doth heartily embrace all such as excel in any worthy virtue. So he's saying Oxford loved to help people out if they had a good idea, if they were a virtuous person, if he really thought they were contributed to humanity. So he's reaching out to others that are good. Then we've got the English ambassador to France. This is 1575. Now, Oxford's 24 years old. He's in Paris, the city of love. And you think, okay, if this guy's a wild guy, he's going to show it when he gets there. But Burleigh had one of his spies, namely the English ambassador, report back to him. And so he does. And he writes to Lord Burleigh, quote, he was well liked of and governed himself very honorably while he was here. A couple of days later, he adds to that, my Lord of Oxford used himself as orderly and moderately as might be desired, and with great commendation. Now, why is that important? You're going to hear this more than once. Great commendation means other people felt the same way about the guy. Now, I think this is the best one of all of them, even though it's in the middle of our little quotation party here. This is Andrew Trollope. He's writing in 1587 from Dublin. He's writing a letter to Lord Burleigh, and he just takes a little detour to say something he wasn't asked to talk about, and it's about the Earl. He says, from the 10th to the 21st year of Her Majesty, that's 11 years, I was deputy to Thomas Gent, Esquire, then steward of the manors and lands of the Right Honorable the Earl of Oxford. And during all that time, being privy not only of his public dealings, but also of his private doings and secret intents, found and knew him endued with special piety, perfect integrity, great care to discharge all trust reposed in him, and no less desire to do good in the Commonwealth. That's a heck of a salute, I think, unsolicited. All right, now Oxford dies in 1604, and we're going to hear some quotes after he's gone. Now, you would think after he's gone, people who didn't like him might come out of the woodwork and talk about him in a negative way. But Nathaniel Baxter writes some verses to Susan Vere. He calls Oxford a valiant prince, and he adds some interesting lines. He says, some think he spent too much in vain. That was his fault. But give honor due, learned he was, just, affable, and plain. But trusted he some men that proved unjust. So he gives us two negative traits. He spent too much and he trusted people too much. But just, affable, and plain, that means he dealt with you face to face and he wasn't trying to get one over on you. George Chapman, 2 years later, in Revenge and Bussy d'Amboise, says the Earl of Oxford was, quote, valiant and learned and liberal as the sun. Now, what does that mean? It means he spent a lot of money, but it's put in a positive way. Instead of, well, he spent too much, it said, yeah, he spent money, but he made everybody around him happy in doing so. Now, Percival Golding is Arthur Golding's son, and he produced a manuscript called The Family of Vere, and he wrote of Edward, quote, I will only speak what all men's voices confirm. He was a man in mind and body, absolutely accomplished, with honorable endowments. Now, the key phrase there to me is what all men's voices confirm. We've already heard twice that a whole group of people thought highly of our hero. And then there's George Buck. He left some papers behind. They were partially burned, but people have gone in there and deciphered part of it. And he writes this about the Earl of Oxford. These are his private papers. Great and stately, opulent and friendly, magnificent, learned, and religious, and so worthy in every way. He loved that guy. And he would say he was friendly, not the kind of thing that Nelson would have us believe. All right, Gervase Markham, 1624. This is 20 years after Oxford died, writes in his book, this nobleman in Italy, France, and other nations did more honor to this kingdom than all that have traveled since he took his journey to heaven. It were infinite to speak of the infinite house he kept to feed all people. He was upright and honest in all his dealings. He was holy and religious. The chapels and churches he did frequent, and from whence no occasion could draw him, the alms he gave, and the bounty which religion and learning daily took from him, are trumpets so loud that all ears know them. That's the third time we've heard. Everybody agrees. Now, Henry Chettle was writing about somebody back in 1592 in Kind Heart's Dream. He doesn't name who he's talking about. It's one of the poets. But he says the unnamed poet has, quote, uprightness of dealing, which argues his honesty. Those are almost the exact same words Gervase Markham uses years later in 1624. Upright in dealing and honesty. Ben Jonson, after he died, Discoveries came out, and he says something interesting about Shakespeare. I love the man and do honor his memory on this side of idolatry as much as any. So that's the fourth time people are saying everybody loved him. He was honest, there's that word again, and of an open and free nature. So he wasn't a plotter behind the scenes. He's open and free. Now we're going to do the last one. This is Sir Ranulph Crewe in 1626, the Chief Justice of the King's Bench. And he reported, quote, I heard a great peer of this realm and a learned say, when he lived, there was no king in Christendom had such a subject as Oxford. Now, I'm just going to summarize the key terms so that we get what they're saying about this guy. Good nature, common sense, well-liked, perfect integrity, just, affable, plain dealing, liberal as the sun, honorable, friendly, of an open and free nature, and upright and honest in all his dealings. And aside from the two faults that we listed of him, that's how people summarized the Earl of Oxford. I think those testimonies wipe out all the innuendo and the inference and speculations that Oxford detractors have left us.
Do you know what I like in particular about that? And I bet Alex is going to say the same thing. But as a lawyer, I always ask, who's the witness? And what are they a disinterested witness? Or do they have something to gain or to lose? If you put a character witness on the stand, opposing counsel is going to try to show that they have an ulterior motive for whatever their testimony is, pro or con the individual in question. And a lot of the originations for some of the negative things that are said about Oxford come from people who very much had an axe to grind against him, or from people like William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, paren, history teaches never trust a Cecil, who was a man who presented himself to society as exceptionally sober, exceptionally Puritan, not puritanical, but Puritan, dressed in black, told his sons, gave them rules for their deportment, a very strict, very much by the book kind of guy who was one of the wealthiest people in England because he took what we would call today bribes or graft for having the ear of the Queen. So he built 3 enormous houses, Burleigh did. He had hundreds and hundreds of servants. He had many fine pieces of art. He had a lot of silver, but he called himself the poorest lord in England. And he is one of the sources of the many negative things said about Oxford, not to mention Arundel and Howard. So, Bob, did any of these people, perhaps with the exception of Percival Golding, who is related to him by blood, do any of these people have reasons that you know of either to be exceptionally complimentary of Oxford?
Most of them had no special reason. They couldn't curry favor after he was dead. And as they quoted, one of them, even said something, admonished him for being too bookish. And another one listed a couple of his negative traits. So these people are, I think, telling the truth. One reason these beautiful words escape us so often is that a lot of times there were, several paragraphs of that flowery, oh, you're the greatest line of Vere's. And so a lot of people just skim it and they go, oh, yeah, this is just some sort of person buttering up the Earl of Oxford. But when you get into the personal language, you see what they really thought about him.
It sounds like he was also incredibly generous. I mean, with money. I mean, I think that shows up in some of the other quotes that you haven't listed, that he was, people needed money. He didn't have a problem
Liberal
handing
as the sun.
handing it out.
I guess, I think, Bob, when you read that list of quotes, there's something very heartwarming about it in that it gives you clearly like this string of pearls of these interactions that Oxford had with people that you can tell that he really met these people and they really had like an interaction. And look, I think that Edward de Vere was probably one of the most charismatic, funniest, most winning people like in history who ever lived. And I think if you were on his good side, it was like you were getting the liberality of the sun, and it was just this overwhelming experience of charisma. We've talked about like Robin Williams as having that same sort of bright beam. I do see, in the comments, I think a lot of people who feel similar to how I do, which is that there is, for me, what I love about Edward de Vere is that I think not that he was always such a great guy, because I think he had many people who were legitimately victimized by him, whose lives he ruined, who I think were right to have thought that he was a terrible person and have said so on the record. But I think that his plays show this deep remorse. And Hank Whittemore once said something about how the tragedies are the best. And I think that Edward de Vere's tragedies are his best work, and they reflect his inability to live up to his highest ideals and his, struggles or his reflection on the way that he let people down in his life. So I think that the portrayals of Bertram, and the kind of themes of Leontes, or even like Timon of Athens, I think these speak to his sort of later reflections on his financial dealings, his dealings with the women in his life. I don't know if it's, I really like in Anderson's Shakespeare by Another Name, I think in the introduction it talks about Edward de Vere as like an ultimately tragic figure who would have been a great roommate, who would have been a great person to share a beer with, but not somebody to share a house with. And that to me, I think is kind of what he was like. I think it balances out. I think he had incredible charisma and could be amazing, but I think he could also be very irresponsible or frankly like narcissistic or addictive or, difficult.
Well, and this goes to something, and I see some in the comments. I'll just quote somebody saying he had his brilliance, but also imperfections. Important not to swing too much the opposite way and consider him all virtue with no vile. And that's what human beings want to do, is make someone all one thing or all another. And he was a human being, which is why human beings all over the world resonate.
I'd like to weigh in on one thing, if I could.
Yeah.
On that very theme. One of the things I think I figured out from reading a lot of the things I believe he published, the thing that I would rate his worst fault is that I think he could be very cruel to people when he decided they deserved it. And I think his saddest victim in that regard was Gabriel Harvey. Now, a lot of people have bought this whole thing that Gabriel Harvey was a nasty guy and he was a pompous ass and everything else. But we have to remember that Oxford was lampooning him right after the Audley End speech in 1578. And I think he was lampooning him on stage from 1579 and in pamphlets all the way up to 1596. And he just, there was a part of it that Harvey deserved, but I think the complete destruction of his hopes and wiping him out completely in print were over the top and really beneath what Oxford should have been doing at his station in life.
I agree that he did not show restraint or maturity in the Harvey interaction. For me, and again, I don't want to throw the book at people, and I'm smarter than to try and debate Bob and Dorothea or whatever. But as I was going through Monstrous Adversary, in preparation for this episode, I think there was like three incidences that I think aren't actually talked about enough in terms of bad things he did, because we hear a lot about the, as William Camden said, the Earl of Oxford, who, wasted and overthrew his patrimony or whatever. But I think we don't hear enough about, he murdered a guy when he was 17. And I don't even count the murder. Like, it was the guy who was an undercook, and it seems like it was maybe an accident, maybe. Although I think that it seems like when Burleigh writes later in his diary that he went out of his way to get it declared self-defense. He's misremembering.
Well, do you know why? Do you know why?
Well,
Because killing anybody at the time was automatic hanging. So if
right.
you
Yes.
Phoebe on the freeway, right, run over somebody that you didn't see who was fixing his tire by the side of the road because it was dark and he had no lights out and his head was hanging in, it's an automatic death penalty. So what you're really watching and what Burleigh did, if it was an accident, it's hard to believe that Oxford murdered with intent. It may have been negligence, right? Which is
there's a couple. I think there's a couple
killing.
of compliments.
Yeah, he didn't murder the guy, right?
Well, the official record. So, but to say this idea that he's always behaving with integrity. So the way that this is handled is that Lord Burleigh stacks the jury, and then this guy who's poor, his wife who's pregnant and has a child, because her husband is ruled a suicide, loses everything, and there's no evidence that Oxford did anything to ameliorate her sufferings for the rest of his life. So he gets away with it because he has the privilege. But what I think is the reason that I say that there might have been malice of intent, or it wasn't necessarily self-defense, is because the legal verdict is that it's suicide, and then they have this BS thing about how the devil tricked the guy and seduced him, and that's why he ran into his sword for the femoral artery. But years later, when Burleigh's recounting it, he remembers it as saying, he's saying, look at what I did for you, Edward de Vere. I made them say that it was self-defense. And so he forgets that what he really made them say was it was suicide. But in his mind, he's saying, I made them say it was self-defense, which implies that it wasn't a self-defense situation.
No, I disagree, Phoebe, because I think what you're tripping over is the status of the law at the time. Self-defense did not exist. It wasn't something that you could pull up. So you're really depending on what the witnesses say. And the witnesses said that the guy ran at Oxford and actually pierced himself with the sword. And that goes to, a negligent homicide, not.
Is that really plausible? I don't know.
Yeah, it's really possible, right?
He ran into the sword, and then the devil.
We don't know who the person was. We don't know the whole context.
Yeah, it was an undercook. It was an
undercook. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
At Cecil House, and Oxford and the tailor were
it was like June or July, and it was in the evening, so it was like a hot summer night. They were
Oxford
out
was out. Oxford was alone, right? Everybody else was gone. He's the orphan. He's there at Cecil House. The tailor to Mildred Cecil and Anne Cecil comes through, and Oxford says, "Here, try it," right? And so they're play fencing with each other with the blunted ends on the sword, so no one gets hurt. And the cook comes roaring out, maybe he had a beef with Oxford. Maybe Oxford had insulted him. We just don't know. And it's at that moment that, right, he runs into Oxford and the sword goes into his leg.
That is, to me, really not plausible. I don't think that. I think the fact that they're making up all this nonsense on the record that the devil seduced him and tricked him into doing it, and that's why he killed himself, they're making up lies. If that's really what happened, why would they make up the fake story about how he was tricked by the devil into committing suicide by running against Oxford's sword? I understand what you're saying about the legal limitations, but I don't know. That's one thing that is even just the aftermath of it, with the fake ruling of the suicide and the poor widow losing everything, is to me unflattering. Even just like the treatment of Anne Vavasor, I think, is really bad. Bob didn't mention in his list of quotes when Anne Vavasor's brother, who's trying to defend the honor of his sister, who's been, was a single young woman at court. Oxford was married. He impregnates her seemingly twice, and then she goes to the Tower of London, names the baby after him, but after Edward de Vere. Edward de Vere obviously doesn't engage with it and instead writes sort of nasty things about her to kind of get back into Queen Elizabeth's good graces, characterizing her as this kind of strumpet. And then the brother defends her and says, if he offers a challenge to Oxford and says, if thy body had been as deformed as thy mind is dishonorable, my house had been yet unspotted, and thyself remained with thy cowardice unknown. I mean, it's true. Like if he had,
Okay.
like if
But
Oxford wasn't
Phoebe,
charming and seductive and sexy, then this guy, the Vavasor home, would not have been, subject
Phoebe,
to scandal.
how many women got impregnated by married men or men with whom they were not married, had babies, and everybody got sent to the tower? Answer, in my research, I'm up to 15. So it happens all the
I get it, but
time.
again, it's the same. It's things happen, but it's the aftermath. And the
Right. But
aftermath
also
is I'm
remember,
going off of Bob's research that he wrote like John Lilly's Endymion, which is incredibly
right.
damning. Earl Showerman's reading of Troilus and Cressida, in which she's, totally slandered and smeared in a way where she is powerless to defend herself, and it makes her look really bad. And
I
it's
mean,
mean.
I understand your defensive, Anne, but just to say, Thomas Vavasor was significantly younger than Oxford, not known to be a swordsman. Oxford was known to be a very good swordsman. Duels were strictly prohibited. And if Oxford had accepted the challenge from a much younger man who was not as skilled as he was and killed him, things would have been a lot worse. So
I'm not saying he
Vavasor,
should have engaged in a duel. I'm saying he probably should have treated the guy's sister better, and then there wouldn't have been a problem.
yeah, but so should like half of the court. So, I mean, to say that Oxford is a bad person for doing this is to ignore, Sir Walter Raleigh, and to ignore Devereux, and to ignore Leicester, and to ignore, of all people, Thomas Vavasor himself. So, I mean, guys got women pregnant all the time in Elizabeth's court. Women had sickness, illnesses in their legs. In their legs? Oh, then they delivered a baby, and then the baby went to the tower. It happened constantly, which is not to say Oxford wasn't a bad boy for doing it, but to leave him alone on the stage as the only man who ever impregnated someone he wasn't married to is really not to understand what went on in that court. And I'm sorry about Anne Vavasor, truly, but, you can always say no.
What
Yeah.
one thing I just want to bring up, somebody says, I'll bring up several comments, and um, somebody says, this is so much of this. We just don't have the facts about so much. We don't know the context. So much of this is, I think we project our own stuff onto sort of a Rorschach
Yeah.
test. And what we think about a lot of this really says more about us than about what really happened. And
Probably true.
and I think it can go back to, yeah, some of it, the interpretation isn't that good, but that's balanced off by the good Bob has
It
been
is.
bringing up too, which shows again he wasn't either. He was a flawed human being who was not a perfect little angel or a rotten person. Somebody up here had said, Alex?
Yes, I wanted to make two observations. One is, of course, even Bob, who did an excellent summary of all those positive accolades about Oxford, even Bob would admit Oxford had enemies. And a lot of those enemies were at court, especially people who'd been satirized or lampooned in the works. And there wasn't a whole lot they could do about it because they also knew that the Queen enjoyed this stuff. The Queen enjoyed seeing many of her lords and ladies satirized in the plays. So their options were kind of limited. They had to put up with it and bear it the best they could. And the second thing I wanted to contribute was look at today's world. Any person, not any person, excuse me, but a lot of really creative people have serious personality problems. I was thinking of Michael Jackson, one of the very best pop musicians ever, and yet his child abuse problems are shameful. What's going to be his legacy, let's say in 60 years or 400 years or whatever? Is he going to be remembered as a child molester or as a artistic person or both? Or look at Cesar Chavez. Look at all the good work he did, and yet his memorials are literally crumbling because of the charges of abuse of young women. And the same thing's true in many, many, many cases. Picasso, many of the people who are prominent in the film industry. It's complicated because I think sometimes they have a feeling that their art is so compelling that a lot of rules that they feel justified in ignoring a lot of rules, and that's my contribution.
Another example that I thought of when Phoebe was talking that sort of falls on the same side is it depends on who you were to him. I love the Beatles, but I don't think I would like John Lennon if I met him. But yet, so many people who were on his good side and warm and close with him say he could be kind and gentle and giving and had all that genuinely positive side. Other people say he could be a cruel bastard, and he could be both. They were both true, and that's what makes complex artists, I think, for one thing, is being a complex, conflicted person, and that's what, well, that's what we see in Shakespeare. As they say, what's the most common thing you hear about Shakespeare? He captured all of humanity. Well, that would take a really complex, conflicted person who I think would have that capability, but also have the capability for remorse. One thing, I've only seen one or two people mention this. I wrote myself a note that I think I saw this years ago in a book, maybe Charlton Ogburn's, but a poem about that Edward de Vere wrote. He's known to have written it, I think, about, and it's an awkward phrase, but those who beat the bush, the bird not gets. The people who, while the noblemen are out there hunting birds, the little peons are out there beating the bush. And that shows a really strange, unexpected sympathy for the servants who are serving the nobles from the Earl of Oxford. It just is sort of like a revealing little comment that he did have some sympathy and humanity for these people under him. I don't know. It's just a
Jonathan,
of something.
You're opening a really good door here, because one of the points that I feel very strongly about is the Earl of Oxford Shakespeare or not? Is Shakespeare the Earl of Oxford or not? Now, in this panel, we all agree that's who he is. And Caroline Spurgeon, 1958, she read all the plays and all the poems, and she said she found five outstanding qualities of Shakespeare's nature: sensitiveness, poise, courage, humor, and wholesomeness. That's a very strong word, I think, in this discussion. What rouses his anger are hypocrisy and injustice, all through the Shakespeare canon. He hates that. What does he value supremely, according to her? Kindness and mercy. And he shows kindness here. And one of the quotes I read said, you try to help people out when they're in trouble. But I like this quote the best. This is Thomas Merriam from 2006. He says, the essential characteristic of Shakespeare's writing is its obscurely sensed but powerful integrity. And if you recall, one of the quotes I read, Trollope from Dublin wrote about Oxford that he had perfect integrity. Now, isn't that interesting? Two people, one assessing Oxford, the other assessing Shakespeare, come up with almost the exact same phrase. And that is a rare trait among human beings.
I obviously, Shakespeare and Edward de Vere both really valued integrity as a value, but that doesn't mean necessarily that he practiced it all the time. For me, my moment in which I like Edward de Vere the least throughout his life that I'm aware of is when he gets into a lawsuit because in 1581 he's trying to get a ward for himself, and we've talked on this show many times about the kind of disgusting hypocrisies and injustices of the wardship system, which he knows better than anyone, having been subjected to it himself. And then there's a widow who's still alive, and she wants to retain control of her children. And he gets into a lawsuit and is suing her and is saying, he accused her of saying, oh, everything that she's saying about how her husband said in his will that my wife will take care of the kids and she'll make sure they're educated and fed and everything. He goes, these were made or executed to no other end or effect or purpose than to defeat, defraud, and avoid the complaining of the wardship. that's not true. The reason that the woman is saying, my husband said I can look after my own children is not, oh, she just wants to maliciously defeat the claim of the just, ward who, or the guy who has the right to have the ward. She's as a mother trying to maintain control of her children to look after him. And then he's fighting her in court because he obviously just wants 160 pounds so that he can have this kid as a ward and exploit him the way that he was exploited himself. And that to me is not a moment of high integrity. And we don't know how it resolved, if he won or if he lost, but he's fighting against a mother who wants to look after her orphaned kid.
I think you have to keep in mind a little, they've torn down statues of people because they were slave owners 150 years ago. So a little bit of it is contextual. I agree about that. I think that was not a good thing to do from a human point of view. I also think from a human point of view, he was wrong in believing that the feudal system was ideal. From what I can tell, he really did believe the king was appointed by God and everybody underneath was appointed, kind of down the line from the same source. And of course, he did that because he was near the top. So of course he embraces all that. So,
but it's also his world, Bob. Bob.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? I
That's
mean,
what I'm saying.
we're trying to put our 21st century sensibilities, back 400 years. That is his world. I mean, he's also supporting the queen with that position, and she was a woman that could have lost her throne any moment in any number of factions and people who thought that a woman shouldn't sit on the throne. So he is near the top of it, but what others are we expecting him to have invented democracy? I mean, I think unless no.
I think a lot of the accolades he was given by these people talking about his good character was probably because of the contrast between his essentially good nature and those of the people around him who were striving and clawing and stealing and ripping off the government and doing everything they could and ripping him off, of course, too.
Yeah.
That relative to those other people that he had to deal with, and I feel sorry for him for some of those power-hungry people, that relatively speaking, he was a gem, and people saw that.
So
I want to bring up,
excuse
me, I just want to bring up one comment because it's just sort of leaps out of the thread for me here. And it shows what we're all talking around is a central thing. Gary says, as an actor, having done 26 of Shakespeare's plays, including Hamlet, Macbeth, Berowne, Angelo, Mercutio, Edgar, currently Lear, when I read Looney's book, I cried and knew I had found the author.
Oh, lovely.
This is what it all comes down to, really, and we're talking around that. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, the power of finding what feels like on a gut level, we finally found the right author. This is what we're all here for. So thank you for sharing that, Gary. It just, to me, that leapt out of the comment thread there.
So can we have a little fun with some of these ox myths that
Sure.
have grown up? Is that an okay direction to take it in the last 15 minutes?
Yeah.
One of my favorites, ox myths, is that his second wife, Elizabeth Trentham, was an heiress. And this is actually a myth that I think Nelson started. I may be wrong about that, but I know that I have heard many, many, many Oxfordians repeat it. And I am saying it's completely not true. And why do I say that? Okay. It was 1,000 pounds. And we don't really know what 1,000 pounds was worth, except for we do, because we can look at other things that are 1,000 pounds. Oxford himself received 1,000-pound annuity from the Queen. We all think it was for writing the plays and the government propaganda. We don't know that because it's not specified. So we have 1,000 pounds coming from Elizabeth Trentham's father's will. You marry Elizabeth Trentham, you get 1,000 pounds. That 1,000 pounds comes in 4 installments over 4 years. So you marry Elizabeth Trentham, you get 250 pounds at a time. And Cecil, his first wife, had a 3,000-pound dowry. His daughter Bridget had a 3,000-pound dowry, 3 times Anne Cecil's. Diana Cecil Thomas Cecil's granddaughter, who married Oxford's son, brought 30,000 pounds as her dowry. What could you buy for 1,000 pounds? Well, just today, I found a 1595 letter of Oxford's where he's writing Cecil, asking Cecil to please get a hold of Bess de Vere's husband, William Stanley, because the contract from his marrying Bess said that he was to give her a 1,000 pound per year stipend for her expenses. So what does 1,000 pounds buy you? 1,000 pounds will buy you a countess's expenses for 1 year. In light of that, in light of the fact that when Oxford was selling his lands, his far-flung lands that were run down by Leicester during his minority, taking that money and buying income-producing lands in and around London, which proved to be very valuable, good real estate investment, he sold many, many times 1,000 pounds in a single year and reaped the benefits. 7 to 12,000 to 20,000 would not be an unusual number for him. So to think that you're going to marry Elizabeth Trentham for her money, she's a commoner's daughter from the Midlands of England. If you marry Elizabeth Trentham, the prize is Elizabeth, not that 1,000 pounds in 250-pound installments. Also, at the time, being a gentleman in London, just to keep up appearances and be part of society, costs about 1,000 pounds a year. So I think our estimation of how much money that was, you can't always calculate it because the calculations vary. The calculations vary for, it's such a long period of time. Bob could explain the math on that. I'm sure I can't. But understanding that Elizabeth Trentham was the prize, not her money. And he certainly did not marry her for her money. So let's stop calling her an heiress.
Thank you, Dorothea. That's really interesting. I'm just seeing in the Q&A, just to throw out stuff as we're kind of making our final turn, just to there's some good questions. So John Shahan says, the author says repeatedly in the sonnets that he's in deep disgrace at the end of his life, lame and despised. I guess I've heard no mention of that. How do you account for what he says about himself there? Bruce Hutchinson says, was he a spendthrift? We've talked about his properties, but we haven't talked about his spending, which is a little fun. And then April says, shouldn't we study Shakespeare's attitude towards commoners more closely? I'm grateful that the point that made that Shakespeare shows empathy for the commoners. Is he snobby? Is he empathetic to the poor?
So on the money issue, some of you may know I write a blog, not the next post, but 2 posts from now, I'm going to give you guys a puzzle. Of these 5 men, all of whom you know, which one died the most in debt and the least in debt? Oxford, Leicester, Robert Dudley, Ambrose Dudley, who was the Earl of Warwick, Sir Philip Sidney, or Christopher Hatton. And I'll give some background to what people spent money on. And in the post after that, I'll answer the question.
Dorothea, you have blog fans in the comments also. Linda said she really enjoys your blog.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so the money issue, I think you all probably know that he inherited his father's debt when he turned 21, because everybody does. You inherit, debts of the fathers did pass through. Burleigh took care of his finances and what he spent during his minority. The Queen gave Leicester his lands. Leicester did not invest in them, of course. He just took the rents. And so Oxford had $2,500 worth of debt service on the day he got his lands back. And his expenses were $2,250 a year. He had to pay his sister's maintenance and he had debts to his uncle. So right out of the bat, he was underwater. He could not pay the debt service he owed on the very day he inherited his lands. But then again, everybody borrowed from everybody. It was what the aristocracy did, and a lot of the money was coming from the rising middle class. So Oxford started selling these lands that had gotten run down. They would require managers. They were way out in the country, and he started investing in like the old garden at Aldgate. He started investing in Fisher's Folly. He started investing in properties that were central to London, very large, very valuable, and by the time of his passing, were worth a very great deal of money. He also came up with a way to, using the Queen, circumnavigate the statute of frauds for transfers, and he had an incredibly innovative estate plan, which I don't have time to go into tonight. So the concept of spending, all of these guys spent lavish amounts of money. The gifts to the Queen alone were eye-popping at New Year's, and that was what was expected of you to participate in this court. Yes, he had acting companies, but don't forget, a lot of the original material is Burleigh saying, don't sell lands, don't sell lands. But Oxford had no choice. His father's debt actually came to £150,000 by the compounding of it over time. It was quite substantial.
I like that Oxford was a big shopper. To me, that's like an appealing quality, but he does buy like 40 he buys 40 pairs of shoes, I think, in the year that he's 20 years old. So that's, I don't know, that's not Imelda Marcos, but that's definitely like Carrie Bradshaw. Like,
But
he
if
definitely
he was,
likes
but
buying stuff.
if he was 20, he didn't have the money because he had to be 21. Yeah. What's that, Burleigh buying?
I think
Okay.
it's after the year that he's really sick in bed when he's still in his minority and he's
Yeah.
like
So
retard.
That's Burleigh's decision, not his. He
Even
doesn't
his
have control of
mom,
his money.
even his mom is writing letters saying he's spending too much money. He's going to run out of all the money. No,
I don't
I
think
think he's
so.
buying stuff.
No, that was Burleigh recording what it cost, what Burleigh purchased. Burleigh was writing the letter showing what good care he was taking care of his wards by purchasing him the velvet cloak and the velvet hose. And this is how much money I, Burleigh, of Oxford's money, am spending to keep this young Earl, my first
Well,
ward.
Burleigh did financially foot the bill for De Vere's daughters, did he not? And leaves them substantial inheritances to the point where Robert Cecil's saying, like, I'm afraid, and this is, I don't trust this account, but Robert Cecil's even saying that Burleigh had left Edward de Vere's three daughters with such big inheritances that he thinks that Edward de Vere might try and kidnap them in order to get the inheritance money. I'm
No,
not
I don't think he
giving
did
any,
because
but
no, because
Burleigh says repeatedly, and I think Edward de Vere even corroborates that Burleigh is the one who's paying for the daughters.
and that's why Oxford puts up Hedingham as collateral for it.
You know, there are a whole bunch of things about him that I believe are just, debatable.
Yeah.
The whole thing about stabbing somebody in the leg. I think if I were going to kill somebody, I would aim for their thigh, and there's an artery in the thigh that can easily bleed you out. Howard and Arundel named 11 people he supposedly plotted to murder, and they couldn't connect, that impulse with any of those people. And what I care most about is the ox myths that, at least in my opinion, we can challenge flat out. And I think the worst ones were put forth by B.M. Ward. He did a lot of good for Oxfordianism, but he also spun these incredible stories. The human mind is apparently built to understand and remember stories better than facts. And once you create a really lively story, about Oxford being a bad guy or whatever, it sticks in people's minds, and it's very difficult to get out of there. But for example, he made this whole thing up from a few phrases in George Gascoigne's book from 1573 that Oxford was behind the whole thing, and he embarrassed Gascoigne, and he stole his name and put it out. And meanwhile, he's in Italy, so I don't know how he did this in 1574 and so forth, 1575. But because 1575 is when the next edition came out, where Gascoigne said, "Yeah, this is my book." And then he claimed because of some posy in there that he was also plotting against Christopher Hatton, which he totally made up. He saw this thing in Barnaby Rich where he's describing someone who's hiding behind a fan of feathers and he's effeminate and so forth. And Ward said, that's our guy. And within 2 months, Rich is back out with another book explaining exactly who the guy is. He's a captain from Rome. So I think it's those stories from the Oxfordians, at least as much as from
I agree.
Nelson, that
I
have
agree.
created this whole cloud about a guy, and it's completely made up.
And
Yes,
yeah,
there's a
Don't just
lot.
take it. I'm only spending 3 seconds on this, but I have pages about this in my book, Oxford's Voices, if you care to look into whether any of these make any sense.
one thing
Bob,
I
haven't you
noted
written
here.
articles?
Oh,
Sorry, Bob,
sorry.
haven't you written articles in the past about how Edward de Vere might have been an alcoholic?
I did write one long ago, and I still think it's possible. However, most alcoholics don't get the kind of personal character accolades that he got from so many people, and so many people agreeing that they all saw these positive things in him. So it's only a possibility, and that's a deep subject because many of the most productive people, and especially the most famous and charismatic people in history, have been alcoholics. So there's a possibility. There's a book written by a friend of mine on how to spot hidden alcoholics that I got a lot of information from, and a lot of it seemed to fit with Edward de Vere. But then there are things that don't fit that well, and I think this list of accolades that he received go a long way toward countering that possibility.
Yeah, I want to. One note I wrote earlier is I think Oxfordians, some not across the board, definitely, but have played this up themselves with a tendency to find it kind of having a bad boy is kind of sexy and exciting to have. He's erratic and flamboyant and all this, whereas Stratfordians think that makes him a bad person and disqualifies him. I think some Oxfordians tend toward the opposite, is you have to be crazy and out of control to be a creative person. Well, I just remember that famous clip, which Supreme Court justice is it at that mock trial?
Yeah.
The opponent slamming his character, and then the
Sounds like a playwright. Yeah.
Sounds like a playwright to me, which is a good quip. But
Yeah. But
I
don't
think
forget,
sometimes people go overboard with the bad boy stuff.
they do. But I mean, I think one thing that came out of Bob's quotes was also a sincere belief in God and a great piety, right? And that can lead one to remorse for what one has done. I mean, how many of us have done something that we wish we hadn't done in life? Somebody that we've wronged, somebody that we've hurt, and we can't go back and fix it. Are we as repentant? Are we as sorry as Oxford was for what he did? Is that the place of someone who takes those moral responsibilities very seriously? I mean, to be young in life is to make mistakes. Hopefully, as we get older, we make fewer of serious ones, but still, it can happen. And sometimes we can't help ourselves, but I doubt there's any of us that would not like to go back and rewrite one thing that we have done that we wish we hadn't.
That's a really great point. And Jonathan Dixon mentioned the Beatles, and they've been asked many times about the cowardly firing of Pete Best. And at one point, Paul said, "We were young."
Yeah.
And now that he's an older guy, he says, "Yeah, we could have done that better." And the idea that Oxford looked back at himself and apologized for his treatment of his first wife in 3 plays or 4 plays at least, right?
Yeah.
But rightly so, I think.
I think he's really
On the other
complex.
hand, if you believe that she delivered a bastard, right? He could have divorced her and shamed her publicly, but he didn't.
Yeah, and James Warren wrote an article in the Oxfordian 2023 where he tried to take all the blame off of Oxford, and I think he did a very good job of it. And said,
Yeah, I mean-
right at Burleigh's feet. He said Burleigh was the one who was plotting and giving him wrong dates and screwing everything up, and no wonder he was confused and angry, you know?
Well, sure, but I mean, no, is he, if the child's a boy, is he supposed to take somebody else's son and put it into the bloodline after 17 generations to be the next Earl of Oxford? I mean, it's a question of honor, and for all of these men, I mean, honor is the biggest thing in their lives. I mean, are you going to be a cuckold? Or are you going to allow Lester to laugh at you behind his hand with his friends? Hey, that's my kid, the next Earl of Oxford. Really? Do you think Oxford would sit back for that? I don't.
I don't know about that, but I'm just gonna make one last comment because I know we're running out of time. One thing we believe Oxford did was to sacrifice himself and his memory to in history completely. He felt that each part of me will be forgotten, and he said that in the sonnets. He did it anyway, and not many people, I think, would be willing to literally obliterate themselves for the glory of literature or the glory of England, however you want to put it. I think that puts him in a special category and puts him half a mile above everybody else who was around him,
That's a
including
wonderful-
us.
Probably, yeah. Oh.
And on that note, it's closing time. Sorry, everybody. We, like I think Bob mentioned earlier, any of these little facets we could go into for a whole half hour on each of the things we've brought up here, but we can't because I got to close up and sweep the floor and go do the dishes and things. So thank you, everybody, and thank you for joining us, Bob, especially for leaping in heroically like this with your knowledge and everything. Alex, Phoebe, Dorothea, thank you as usual.
Thank you, Jonathan.
See you all
Jonathan.
next time. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, good night.